Hi, today we are going to talk a bit about the lecture that most of you students missed right before spring break here. A lot of you kids took an early vacation, plus I was sick too, that didn't help. So I'm going to cover this for my C block for when I was sick, and then for my B block, many kids are absent taking an early vacation here. So what the lecture was talking about was Eisenhower. Remember, his nickname was Ike. It talked a lot about his domestic policies. Foreign policies were covered in the previous chapter. And a little bit about the birth of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which happens during Eisenhower's time as president. So Eisenhower, his campaign slogan, a lot of presidents, have those campaign slogans, square deal for Theodore Roosevelt. New Deal for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, fair deal for Harry Truman, and so forth. Eisenhower talks about modern republicanism for what his policies are going to be like. They're going to be compassionate and liberal with human beings, but conservative fiscally with money. Conservative with money, liberal with human beings. So that's modern republicanism. Modern republicanism. Kind of like a shift, because remember the previous Republican president, Hoover, he was seen as, not very compassionate towards individuals, not very caring towards people suffering in plight. Eisenhower wants to get away from that. His party to be more of a middle of the road, not to be dragged to the far right, to be right down the middle is what he's trying to do here. The New Deal. A lot of the New Deal programs put in place by FDR. Remember the Democrats, they had won 5 straight presidencies. FDR wins 4 straight, dies very early, like 3 months into his 4th term. But then Harry Truman wins a presidency. So they won 5 straight presidencies, 4 with FDR, a 5th with Truman. Truman's basically serves 3 years and 9 months of FDR's final term. So he's almost in office for 8 whole years, 7 years and 9 months or something like that. But 20 straight years you have a Democrat president. And a lot of these policies were put in place by FDR and to Truman. And these New Deal policies, a lot of them were meant to be temporary, just during the Great Depression. For example, like the CCC, all these young men and eventually young girls go off to work, planting trees and so forth. But when World War II happens, when Pearl Harbor gets bombed, we need to take those young men out of the CCC and shift them to the war necessities, turning them into soldiers, making them work in factories and so forth for the war effort. So a lot of the New Deal programs were temporary and even meant to be temporary, but a lot of them were meant to be permanent. The FDIC to help people's confidence in banks, to prevent bank runs and the bank panics. Social Security and so forth. Some of these programs were meant to last the test of time, meant to be, to go on after the Great Depression, to help prevent a future depression and so forth. And a lot of Democrats were worried, look, we've had the presidency for 20 straight years, now Republicans in office, what's the first Republican going to do? Is he going to destroy it? So that's why I have a question mark here. Because a lot of the Democrats thought that the first Republican would naturally try to destroy, take down all these New Deal programs that FDR and Truman had put in place during their 20 years in office. And remember, Truman increases a lot of the New Deal programs and tries to increase a lot of the New Deal programs with the Fair Deal. The Social Security. Eisenhower shocks a lot of Democrats. He increases Social Security benefits. He increases unemployment benefits. Eisenhower increases minimum wage from 75 cents an hour to $1 an hour. And note, that's a 33% wage increase when you think about it, 75 cents to $1. And $1 back then has the same purchasing power as about $8.50 today. So I mean, remember, dollar back then has more purchasing power. It's worth more than $1 today. So when you hear $1 minimum wage, that's about $8.50, higher than the actual minimum wages today in terms of purchasing power. So Eisenhower, a lot of Democrats were pleasantly pleased with the fact that he doesn't tear down any New Deal programs already in existence, and in fact increases several New Deal programs here: Social Security, unemployment, minimum wage. Eisenhower, however, blocks a push for national health care. You know, after World War II, some of the European countries like Britain are moving into that national health care system. Truman wanted to go in that direction, but was stymied by Congress. Eisenhower doesn't support that. Right or wrong, he feels that the government shouldn't be involved in that. He believes that the government would block the innovations of finding new medicines and so forth, and that the national government should stay out of that, keep it in the private sector. Highway Act of 1956. You know, to me, this is kind of like, classic Americana. This building of the roads, building of the highways. In the World War I era, Eisenhower had to take this, army unit and take them across the country, from east to west. And it took them something like 42 days, and you have to go widening all the towns, all these little towns, and you get into little choke points. A lot of the roads, remember, there are no massive highways. A lot of the roads they took were dirt and mud when it rains, and you get all these congestion points in every little town. And during World War II, he sees, the Autobahn in Germany, and he wants to help push this. And one of the sad facts is they have to help push this. One of the main arguments is, well, if we're ever invaded, we'll need to shift troops and stuff like that. But the Highway Act, over 41,000 miles of highway are built from this Highway Act during Eisenhower's presidency. Just a massive amount. You think 41,000 miles over that amount, it's about roughly something around 2,000 miles from New York to LA. So you can see, this is just a massive amount. I think I even read once that every city at the time of 100,000 plus people was connected in some way to a highway. Something to that effect, I believe I read once. So this Highway Act, to me this is like classic America, the post-war boom, the good economy, people have new cars again, and you can grab the family, hop in a car, and drive to where you want to go, explore the country. A lot of areas in national parks and stuff were in remote areas and hard to reach, and the Highway Act, helps connect some areas that weren't, that were more remote beforehand. So the Highway Act, it helps tourism, it helps business, it helps connect our country, helps people travel. The NDEA, the National Defense Education Act. The National Defense Education Act is, notice again, Cold War era, Defense Education Act. They pass it saying for defense. The NDEA basically says, look, we want to be a world superpower. And as a world superpower, we need to have the best education. So what are we going to focus on with education? What we're going to focus on with education is, number one, we're not going to tell them how to teach, but we're going to give colleges and universities more money for teaching certain subjects. We'll give them more money for teaching math, science, and engineering, because we need to have the most technology. If we teach these subjects who have more technology, this will keep us a superpower. On the other hand, the second thing you're going to focus on is, if we're going to be a superpower, we need to be able to relate to other countries. And we need to be able to relate to other countries in such a manner where we can be on good terms with them. So the second subjects that we're going to focus on, they say, is foreign languages, foreign culture. And that way we can talk to them in their language, instead of you must speak English because we speak English and so forth. And we can build better friendships and partnerships if we can speak in their language some of the time, if we can understand their culture a bit more. So the NDEA is paying colleges more money for teaching those math and science and engineering, and then the foreign language, foreign culture. Eisenhower, he wasn't super gung-ho about civil rights. However, he was kind of middle of the road. However, he did support the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was the first Civil Rights Act since Ulysses Grant was president, all the way during Reconstruction right after the end of the Civil War. And he wanted it to be stronger. However, some Southern senators took the teeth out of it. Southern senators who opposed integration and opposed black voting rights and so forth. And the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was supposed to help with African American voting rights with a lot of racist laws and stuff, especially in the southern states that were trying to disenfranchise African Americans. We're actually successfully disenfranchising African Americans. However, a lot of southern senators took the teeth out of this. And because of that, it wasn't very effective. Eisenhower actually talked and thought about vetoing it. But he talked to some various leaders, including African American leaders, and they said, well, just pass it anyways. And it was very unsuccessful. Something to the effect of 2% of the out of the African Americans who should have been able to vote, only about 2% were actually able to vote. And it only increased it to about 4%, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. So highly ineffective, highly ineffective. Although Eisenhower did want it to be more effective. He was thwarted by southern senators and stuff like that down south. Once again with transportation, Eisenhower works with Canada to open the St. Lawrence Seaway up to bigger, more modern freighters to be able to go from the Great Lakes out to the Atlantic Ocean, to be able to take freighters, the big locks, as the lakes are at different levels and so forth, and you got waterfalls and stuff. So the St. Lawrence Seaway, with the locks working with Canada, so you can take bigger freighters. This opens up the Great Lakes for more industry and so forth for Canada and America. Remember, like historically, like Civil War era and so forth, most of the industry in America is in the Northeast, and then like Massachusetts, New York City, Philadelphia, and and so forth, Northeast, and then it starts to shift kind of into the Great Lakes region, and then by 1920 and so forth, in the late 1800s, and you look at a lot of the big industrial cities are in the Great Lakes: Chicago, Detroit, Toledo, Gary, Indiana. It kind of shifts, and now the kind of shift, in the 80s and 90s and so forth, and today, a lot of factories and stuff are starting to move down south. A lot of it's becoming more industrial now. All right, NASA. NASA's created in the 1950s. And Eisenhower says, he wants it to be non-military. He wants it to be kind of have this peaceful message. So this is it's supposed to be a non-military space exploration agency. And I know I'm kind of going quick here, but we have cleaners coming into the room any second here. But you get the birth of the civil rights movement. Really, for the 60s is really in the 50s in Eisenhower's presidency here. For example, 1954, you have the famous Brown v. Board of Education ruling. And there's several cases. The most famous one is Linda Brown's, this little girl, and her father in Topeka, Kansas, has to drive all the way across the Topeka, Kansas, to find the school that's an African-American school because of segregation, because of racism. And he has to drive by several all-white schools to drop his daughter off at a black school. And he sues. This is not fair. And so he sues. And it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, along with some other cases. And Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, knows he can have a majority, but he waits to convince, because he knows it needs to be unanimous. He knows the country needs unanimous, so people can't say, well, some justices agree with segregation. He knows it needs to be unanimous, so he waits and waits until he can convince the justices to make it unanimous. So that's Brown v. Board of Education. It says separate cannot be equal. In 1954, overturns that. I think in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, where separate was separate but equal. It overturned separate but equal in 1896. Plessy v. Ferguson, Brown v. Board overturns that. This is one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in U.S. history. It's very, very influential. It's going to be on the AP exam, most likely. It's one of the two most likely ones to be on there. The other most likely one would probably be Margaret v. Madison with the Midnight Justices, and John Adams with all his Midnight Justices, and then Jefferson not wanting to seat him, which leads to John Marshall's ruling, which gives judicial review. But very, 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 very important. Earl Warren. Earl Warren Supreme Courts tend to expand civil liberties. The problem with Brown v. Board, though, is Brown v. Board says, you need to desegregate with all due process, all due speed. What is due speed? Is that by the end of the school year? Is that next school year? Is it when the majority of the community agrees? What is with all due speed? And so for even years and years and years later, after this ruling, you still have some schools and so forth segregated. One thing students often fall into a trap is they think that all segregation in schools and in colleges and high school across the nation in 1954. That's not true. It's the slow process starts. Unfortunately, it takes some schools a decade or so after this ruling to finally get that due speed where they are forced to desegregate. And Eisenhower and JFK at times even have to send military in to desegregate at times to protect the African American students from vicious attacks from white students. Eisenhower, Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, had to send in the 101st Airborne and take control of the National Guard. JFK had to do something similar, and those were controversial decisions. I mean, kind of interesting is JFK when he was a U.S. Senator, refused to endorse Eisenhower's use of military force. It was controversial. A lot of people who even thought desegregation should happen at the same time said, well, you shouldn't have to use the military. But then the bit of irony is that JFK himself used the military as president to help desegregate at times. Rosa Parks in the 50s, setting up this 1960s great civil rights push. 1955, she's technically sitting in the middle of the bus, not the front of the bus is what is usually said. But African Americans, they're supposed to get up and move to the back, and then once the back's full, if there's more whites get on, then you're supposed to stand up and give up your seats, and the whites in the front and the back, and if you're in the middle and enough whites get on, you're supposed to move. She says, I'm tired, I'm physically tired, I'm emotionally tired, I'm mentally tired, I'm sick of moving to the back, I'm just fed up with it, and she refuses to move. She gets arrested, she gets fingerprinted, and this leads to the Alabama-Montgomery bus boycotts. And sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes people only listen when you hit them in the wallets, when you start affecting their money. And so a lot of African Americans, who are a lot of the primary customers of these buses in Montgomery as they travel to work and so forth, they boycott, they refuse to do business. And the bus will show up and open its doors. And African American customers wouldn't get on board. And what are you doing? Why aren't you getting on the bus? Well, we'll get on the bus when Jim Crow gets off. Meaning, we'll get on the bus when you start treating us like first-class citizens instead of second-class citizens. We have respect. We're human beings. We deserve the same American rights. We just fought World War II, ended a decade ago. We fought that, for certain basic rights, did we not? MLK Jr. Gets his start here. He helped with the Montgomery bus boycott. And he's leader of something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And MLK Jr., he gets his start in the 50s and becomes more well-known and a national figure in the 60s. With 1963 is the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech and so forth. But, and other things in the 60s. But, he's starting to become the national figure in the 50s here. The Greensboro sit-ins happens in 1960. Eisenhower is still president, but in North Carolina, Greensboro, at a Woolworth, 4 African-American men go in, and it's a segregated restaurant. They don't serve blacks, and they sit down peacefully, and just, and they're told, we don't serve African-Americans or whatever, and they refuse. We're not going to leave. We'll just sit here and wait until you change your mind. But it's peaceful. However, these sit-ins then start, and other people start doing them, and it becomes more and more common throughout the 60s. And then other people start having like teach-ins and so forth. It kind of evolves, and different people use them for different things. And some white people then would start joining African Americans in sit-ins. And unfortunately, sometimes they're attacked, even though they're being peaceful, sitting there. Sometimes people pour food on them, drinks on them. The salt and pepper shakers pour it out on them. Sometimes get physically violent. Punch them off, push them off, drag them out of the store or restaurant. Really, really, really kind of sad. But the Greensboro sit-ins were fairly effective too. We're just going to sit in here quietly, not cause a ruckus, but we're going to sit here and wait for you to change your mind to service, because we're people, we deserve service. In the SNCC, this oftentimes called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also gets its start at the end of Eisenhower's administration in 1960, and you'll hear more about them when they get to the 60s. But he's famous for like Stokely Carmichael. Eventually, they start to move away from the nonviolence a bit in the 60s and more towards Black Power and things like that. But SNCC is also famous for organizing a lot of the protests for registering people to vote in Selma and so forth. And so they're kind of famous for that. And obviously, Martin Luther King has a connection to that too, obviously. But all right, so that's just a quick breakdown of some of the things you missed. Of course, as always, read the chapter, ask for questions. Feel free to ask me questions. And keep reading, keep preparing, keep reviewing for the AP exam. All right, thank you.